I know. So welcome to all the ePAG representatives joining the call. Today, Vicky has very kindly come to share give an update really on a lot of the activities and thinking happening behind the scenes in establishing European reference networks. The joint action has been set up the past few years to support ERNs implement common standards across and common ways of working. So there's been a number of workshops over the past year, which Vicky has been leading on, doing a fantastic job getting the clinicians from all the networks come together to share knowledge on specific topics. So today we're going to get some feedback on what happened from a couple of workshops. So Vicky is the Work Package 6 lead under the RD Action, which is the Joint Action for Rare Diseases, and we're very fortunate to have her support today. So thank you, Vicky. Just a bit of housekeeping. I think the presentation's in two parts, so we're going to stop after the first section and there'll be questions, but it's not a very big group of people, so your microphones are all switched on. So if you want to ask a question or an area of clarity, please do so. You can do that in the chat box, or we can wait till the end of the first presentation. So Vicky, thank you very much for supporting today.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the webinar. Thank you for having me, Matt, and EURORDIS colleagues. So some of you will have been on the other big webinar that we did, I think it was around about this time last year actually, which was feeding back from our first big workshop dedicated to the ERNs, and this was the one in Brussels on virtual care. So as Matt said, what we wanted to do today is to talk first of all a little bit about the workshop that we did on data and data standardization, and that's very relevant for the ERN IT platform. I should just clarify that in the end I opted not to present the platform itself, that is the CPMS, the Clinical Patient Management System, for three reasons. One, I wanted to give you some sort of added value in terms of what we discussed in that big workshop that we co-hosted with the Commission at the end of April. Secondly, I think that there's always some sensitivity about whether external bodies like the Joint Action, whether we should be the people to actually officially present these Commission platforms. But thirdly, the providers of that platform, OpenApp, they actually do offer webinars. So I think some of the ERN coordinators have sort of sent these links around to their participating centres, and also ePAGs should be involved in that. So if you're on Twitter, OpenApp often tweet these sort of open webinars that they do directly on their system. So we thought this would be a better way to approach it. So as Matt says, I'll talk for, we've got quite a long slot today. We've got about an hour and a half, and there's no way we can cover everything that happened in total almost 4 days of workshops, but the idea is to give you some of the highlights of that and also guide you to where you can find more information. So I'll talk about the data workshop first, and then as Matt said, we'll stop and if you have any questions at that point we can discuss those, and then move on to quite a different topic, which is indicators and outcomes. So I think you'll all probably be familiar with the Joint Action, RD Action. I hope so. But basically, we focused a lot of our policy and integration work and funding around the topic of ERNs. We have a really nice summary that we've done just in recent weeks, actually, which you can follow this long link here. You have all the slides, but that gives a nice sort of 2-page summary of everything and the different types of support that we've offered to the ERNs and the ERN community. So do have a look at that if you have a chance after the webinar. But our guiding sort of statement once the ERN call went out was that, okay, for many years we've been working on trying to prepare the field and add some meat to the bones of an ERN concept. So now the networks are almost there, or indeed are there and are starting now to evolve. We want to explore with the ERN community how they can find some common solutions to some of these shared challenges and not reinvent wheels, and help everybody move forward. Because the ERNs essentially are a really good opportunity to get things right. So we're starting from scratch in all of these 24 networks, even if some of them are built on, for example, successful research networks. It's a new beginning, it's a good chance to move forward. So, as I said, the focus on really the second half of our project, and we officially end at the end of May next year, was very much around trying to identify good practices and policy, but doing this with the networks for the network. So not just sort of creating guidance ourselves and sort of pushing that onto the ERNs, but actually getting them to help us in generating these policy documents. So this is just our workshop plan. I mentioned already to you that big workshop we did in Brussels a year ago, which was on virtual care and many different aspects of that. And the ones I'm going to talk about this morning, still this morning here, is around data and interoperability in ERNs and how we can make the most of this opportunity. And secondly, the topic of indicators and outcome measures for ERNs. This is the rest of our workshop plan as it stands. Now, personally, I would like to have a lot more clarity and security at this point in the project, given that we don't have too long left on exactly what we're going to deliver. But as you'll all know, being involved in the ERNs, this is a very dynamic field, and things are changing all the time. So we have to stay a little bit flexible to make sure that we are offering workshops on topics and aspects of those topics that are going to be really useful for everybody involved. So our next confirmed workshop is at the end of this year in Rome on clinical practice guidelines, especially on impact of these. And we're also going to be delivering a workshop in April on integrated care. And this will be partnering with Raquel Castro, who many of you will know through EURORDIS, and the work that they do in a project called InnovCare, which is all about innovative integrated care models. We'll also deliver one workshop, possibly two small ones, on the research topic, specifically around how ERNs can add value in terms of things like engaging with industry, engaging with the EMA. But, follow our website because you'll have more details of this as soon as we have them. Just a reminder that everything I'm talking about today and all of our outputs that we produce are all in one place. This is the link up the top here, and you'll be able to find here a dedicated links to all the documents that we produce, but you'll also find a dedicated link to each of these workshops. So on each of these you can go and you can find the agenda, and you can click on the interactive PowerPoints which show you what was delivered and what was presented. And then for some of these we also produce recommendations and toolkits, but I'll explain a bit about that in a second. Yes, of course, I can go a bit slower, Nicole. So this is what we roughly call workshop 2. Meaning that this is the second big workshop that we delivered once we knew who the ERN coordinators would be. So we delivered this one at the end of April in Brussels. It was co-hosted by DG Sante, so it went back to back with a lot of other important meetings. And that was really useful for us because at the end of the day, if we're talking about data and standardization of data, then let's be honest, the main, most obvious instrument through which data will flow or be collected in the ERNs is in fact the official CPMS, the Clinical Patient Management System, which is what all the networks will soon be using to do these virtual meetings. So we don't want this guidance and these discussions to be very theoretical and just to sit there and to have no impact. It's important that actually they can be used. And so for us, it was very good that the Commission colleagues and the IT colleagues in charge of procuring this platform were there and were participating. So the reason that we organised this workshop is because back in our first big workshop on virtual care, we talked about lots of things that one could do to increase the efficiency and the use of virtual consultations. And a lot of these, alongside the practical hints about getting people together on time, making sure all the participants of these virtual meetings are all prepared, making sure there's a good internet bandwidth, etc., there were a lot of quick wins around how you could collect data and what you could do to data in the rare disease field. And a lot of these lessons in terms of how you code data, how you capture it, how you can make it more shareable and interoperable, they've come actually through the research field over the last decade or so, but especially the last couple of years, I've noted that there's really a trend towards pushing certain standards within the rare disease field. And the reason that people are pushing these standards is because they have an impact in this era of electronic data sharing. So we decided that actually, because a lot of our coordinators asked for more specific, more practical guidance on what these different tools and coding resources can do for them, we would actually have quite a detailed, practical, instructive workshop to show them exactly what these tools can do. So this is why the PowerPoints actually for this workshop, if you really want to go into some detail about the topic, that's the best place to go, because they talk you through exactly how you can use things like the ARPANET coding system, like the human phenotype ontology, and I'll talk about these in a second. So this workshop was a day and a little bit. The little bit was at the end of day one. It was the end of one of the formal coordinator meetings, and we started off with a sort of an hour-long brainstorming session to try to establish, well, what we optimistically call the state-of-the-art of data sharing for care in ERNs. What did this mean? It meant that actually at this point we sat with all of the participants, all 65 of them, and we tried to go back to basics and to ask our participants, what actually is the ultimate purpose of this CPMS? I'll call it the CPMS from now on, but again, it's the Clinical Patient Management System. So what's the purpose of it? It's to enable virtual care. Registries are very important, they're great, and some of the ERNs are, almost more interested in what sort of registry architecture and tools they might be given at some point. But the bottom line is that this CPMS is, if nothing else, it's to make a safe system to collect and share information and get second opinions, get expert advice and diagnoses across borders. So with that in mind, we wanted to know what sort of purposes people could actually use that data for. Because we know from the tender which went out to select this CPMS, this IT platform, we know that in there one of the conditions was that the data which is collected on me as a patient for care, for review, if I consent, that data will be pseudonymized. It'll be made, de-identifiable, so it's not linked to me, but it can be retained and it can be searched within this platform. So we said, okay, that's a very good function. We hear all the time in rare diseases about the need to be able to share data and make better use of that data. But what do people actually want to use it for? So we brainstormed this, and actually people want to use these cases for educational purposes to show, especially in some of the surgically oriented ERNs, they want to show, what sort of presentations resulted in what sort of surgical decisions, whether to operate or not to operate. People were very keen to know more about the different clinical presentations that you can get under the same genetic condition. So this is the so-called genotype-phenotype relationship. That's important because not everybody with, for example, limb-girdle muscular dystrophy type 2 has exactly the same phenotype. There are many different sub forms of that condition with slightly different genetic variations, but they can have very, very different clinical presentations and very different outcomes. So patients need to know which of these they have, and for this our doctors and researchers need as much information as they can about how these things go together. Some of the coordinators felt this information would be very useful for their diagnostics. Some of the ERNs are very much about diagnostics. Others felt, again, they could actually use some of this data to start enrolling patients in studies and trials. It depends very much on how much data they collect there, I think. But what was, the main conclusion was, as we expected, our 24 networks plan to use this data in the CPMS in very different ways. Some of them really aren't concerned about having registries shared through this system. They have very good registries, for example, in the pediatric cancer field, and they're not thinking that the CPMS will replace that for them, because a registry is a very specific thing. It answers a very specific question. However, other ERNs which have less by way of registry infrastructure were actually quite keen to see what potential, if any, there might be for this CPMS to give them some sort of registry infrastructure in future. Matt's asked me about a phenotype. I'm actually going on to that in a second, so I'll give a proper description of exactly what that is, because it's the term, you're right, it's thrown around a lot, but it's not always clear what we mean by it. So the kind of summary or conclusion of this brainstorming session about what data will be shared and for what purposes will it be useful, the bottom line is that actually in terms of the data elements, all the networks will want to collect pretty different things. They want to collect things related to the eye or related to the liver or the muscles, and not everybody will collect everything every time. But what matters, and this was the key principle we tried to push in this workshop, what matters is that actually everybody collects that data in the same way. It's not the same data, but it's collected in the same way using the same standards. So Day 2 of this workshop was all about focusing on 4 particular tools or resources that can help to increase the utility, the usability of data, both for a primary one-to-one consultation, but actually more importantly in terms of understanding better what these diseases are and how they manifest in different people, what the impact of them is, and actually supporting research. So it's about one-on-one patient benefit, but also driving forward knowledge for the whole field so that all of us benefit in the long term because we have more information, more understanding of these conditions and their impact. And we chose these 4 tools and resources because these were the ones that were highlighted at our big Brussels workshop a year ago on virtual care. And they are the OrphaNet nomenclature, which we'll often hear described as the Orpha code or the OrphaNet ontology. So that's about how you code rare diseases. The human phenotype ontology, I'll talk about that in a second. The concept of how you might link data, or at least make data linkable in rare diseases. And this you might have heard described in the past as an identifier or a pseudonymizer. And then fourthly, this concept which some of you may have heard about and you'll be hearing more about in the coming months and years, which is the FAIR data concept. And that is an acronym, and I'll go back to that in a second as well. So I've got a slide on each of these 4 resources to explain to you what they are and why we should care, frankly. So OrphaNet nomenclature, we talked quite a lot about this in the webinar that Matt and I did a year ago, but the bottom line is that actually if you can't code rare diseases properly, then you can't see them. So if you capture dozens and dozens of rare diseases, different, very distinct diseases, using a very generic code, and that you might do if you go to a hospital and you have a busy clinician who doesn't really understand the specifics. You've got some data coder in one of our hospitals and they just put this catch-all code in. What that means is that you can't capture the true picture of how many patients are actually out there living with these individual diseases. So you can't have any sort of robust epidemiological data, meaning you don't know how many patients you have, you don't know how common the conditions are. It's very hard to track people over time if you can't actually tell that this is a patient with, let's go for limb-girdle muscular dystrophy type 2A. If you just know that this is a muscular dystrophy patient, that's very, very different, and you're going to miss all of the long-term specific symptoms and path of progression that particular patient will have. And that's not helpful to the patient, it's not helpful to their family, and it's not helpful to the doctors who are trying to care for them. It's also very important to use a proper system for coding rare diseases if you want to do, for example, clinical trials, because drug companies are not going to be doing clinical trials for muscular dystrophy. They're going right down here more and more to very specific genetic forms of muscular dystrophy, because these sort of new age and modern therapies, they are often targeted to a particular mutation. So it makes sense that if you want to find those patients for your clinical trials, you have to be able to capture that they have that specific condition. So we have lots of policy and legislation across Europe which says that actually the best system for rare diseases, to code rare diseases clinically, is the Orpha code. And that is the Orpha number, which is created and maintained by the OrphaNet team in Paris in the central database. An Orpha number and an Orpha code is exactly the same thing. It looks the same thing. They just call it an Orpha code when it's used to actually code a patient for some sort of a purpose. So the problem is that very often, especially in a lot of the mainland European countries, when you go to the hospital, what the hospital is really interested in capturing is not always your specific diagnosis. They might be if they're sort of an expert centre for rare diseases, and we'd hope they would be, but often hospitals in the main healthcare system, they capture something called your diagnosis-related group. So they want to know roughly what category you fall into, because they base their costs on that when they're dealing with the insurance companies and reimbursing your care. But just, I always show this little diagram to show why actually it's important to use author code. So ICD-10 up here, let's see if I can use the pointer. So ICD-10, you can see a little green arrow up here, is probably one of the most common systems for coding diseases generally, and it's used all across Europe. The problem is, if you take two very different conditions, so up here we take condition 1, condition 2, under the ICD they would both have the same code. So we know that ICD-10, which is the latest version of ICD, is actually quite poor for rare diseases. So they would give both of these conditions this single code, which is Q87.8. And if you look down here, it tells you what that means. It means other specified congenital malformation syndromes, not elsewhere classified. Now that is really quite useless. It's very, very broad. It's very generic. And it's kind of a catch-all for, well, we don't know what else to call them. We'll use this code. It's the best fit. But in fact, if you look at both of these conditions, you have on the one hand, I can never say this, cardiomyopathic lentiginosis. This has an author code, you can see here circled, of 500. That's the author number, also the author code. Up here, we look at cerebrohepatorenal syndrome. Again, very different condition. And under author code, it has its proper unique code. So the only way that you can know that these people have different conditions, and the only way that you can track these people and that you can actually trace their symptoms and get an idea of what they are is if you code them properly. So what we did in the workshop was we gave some practical, I'll just take that pointer off. We gave some practical demonstrations of what the advantages are of using the code, and it's building a little bit on what I just showed you there, but taking it to more examples and how you could, for example, even if you don't know the specific diagnosis, how you can still get an idea of the overall, the closest code to code something better than nothing. So what we tried to do is, after the demonstrations, we tried to give people some practical tools to help them use author code and the AuthorNet system in their ERNs. And all of these discussions resulted in a document, a guidance document, which is the recommendations on standardizing data in the ERN framework. So we'll make sure that you all have this document. You can find it on our website, and this is the most important output from that workshop that we had. So what we did is, for each of the 4 tools that I'm talking about here, or the 4 resources, we wrote a little section explaining what that tool is and why it matters. And then we had a little section with some recommendation points. And those of you who are familiar with the USAID recommendations and the recommendations from the expert group, we try to sort of mimic this sort of structure and have the same kind of look and feel to it. The difference is that when we wrote this, we haven't got an expert group to have it adopted by. So instead, we shared it with all of the ERN coordinators and all of the workshop participants and all of the experts who talked about our 4 key tools. And so we are happy that what we have is quite a good consensus document which tells you what are these 4 tools and resources, why you should care, and then gives some advice on how we should use them. So you can see here, for example, it explains in the coding section the fact that the author code has been approved at the European and global levels, and it gives you links to where those documents are. So it gives you data about it, and then we have a recommendation section. So for example here, a very broad recommendation, but nonetheless very important, is that ERNs, and as far as possible their healthcare providers and affiliated partners, in the course of their broader daily activities, should promote and utilise the author code as the preferred nomenclature for capturing the suspected or confirmed diagnosis of a rare disease. So we explain in here that actually all systems which are used to share data, and here of course we are particularly thinking about the CPMS, which all the ERNs will use, it's important that there's an opportunity to actually put in that author code on these patient records, and also ideally to have a second field which gives the user some sort of a chance to indicate how confident they are in that accuracy of the diagnosis. So is it confirmed, is it suspected, or undetermined? And we took these based upon the expert discussion and advice at the workshop. We also put in here a little bit of a link to a toolkit that we created, which basically gives all of the ERN coordinators some next steps for what they can do here. For example, the author code and the AuthorNet nomenclature, it's good, it's the best that we have, but it's not perfect. So one practical thing we said to the ERNs is that, look, you might want to, over the coming months or years, prioritize improvement of the author code for your disease area as one of your main activities. Because who better than the ERNs to actually say, look, the way in which you've described the symptoms of, for example, limb-girdle muscular dystrophy 2A is not accurate, and in fact we have more modern knowledge, and this is what we should be doing. So we showed them how they can actually start to curate and update the content of this central database, and that then benefits the whole field globally, because the better your information about the rare diseases in this author coding system, everybody can then benefit from that. I'm going to fast forward a little bit because I want to cover all four of these areas. The second big win, or easy win, that we try to promote to the ERN community is that they should be using a standardized terminology to do their phenotypic descriptions. So what does that mean? So your phenotype is your clinical presentation. It's basically a summary of the symptoms that you present with. So your genotype is your genetic information. It's your specific, genetic mutation. But your phenotype is what you see in front of you. So it's clinical symptoms describing what you have. So the problem here is that when two doctors, let's say Matt and I are doctors, and we're having a conversation about a patient, I might say, my patient has a long, narrow head. It's a little bit easy, but a bit colloquial, but I might say that. What Matt might say is, well, my patient has scaphalocephaly. Or he might say, my patient has dolichocephaly. I'm sorry for those of you who are doctors and who's, when I'm pronouncing these things, I could be doing a terrible job. But the point is, these are all terms that you could use to describe the same thing, which we see on the baby at the bottom here. The same thing if you're talking about a small head. I might say my patient has an unusually small head. Matt might say my patient has nanocephaly. He might say my patient has microcephaly. When you're talking to a doctor, you have an idea, usually, that that's the same thing. But because everything is shared and collected electronically these days, and especially because we're looking in our clinical systems, our electronic health record systems, and in our registries, we want to make data useful and poolable to drive forward our knowledge, you have to have a way for computers to actually understand these language issues. So that's why you need somebody to map all of these different possible terms and to put that into a built-in ontology, a system of coding and terminology that can be shared by one computer to another, but more importantly can be understood as meaning the same thing. So another example, if you do a query through OMIN, which is a big database on genetic mutations, these are all similar terms. They're not exactly the same thing, but you can see the different way in which people describe these. Huge bones. How would you describe the distance? When does a bone become huge as opposed to big or large? A lot of these things actually mean the same thing, but in some cases they don't mean the same thing. And it has to be very clear when these symptoms are different, because only by being able to really measure and track exactly what clinical phenotypic symptoms a patient has, can you get an accurate picture of what the accompanying symptoms for any genetic diagnosis are, and only then can you actually prescribe the best possible care and therapies and standards of care for that patient. So again, we did the same thing with the human phenotype ontology. We had a very long, very detailed presentation on how you can use this, and it's also very, very useful in the research field. What we're trying to do is bring it more and more into the care field, because there are ways in which you can use this ontology, which immediately takes the care records that you collect on your patients in the ERN. Remember, we said that you can pseudonymize those and make them searchable. So you can search the whole, essentially, database worth of patients. You can get really valuable information on there on the precise clinical symptoms that a patient has, but only if you capture them in the same way. Otherwise, you're going to have to manually go through everything and think, okay, are we talking about the same symptoms here? So we put, again, some recommendations here. So, for example, at a basic level, we said that ERNs, and as far as possible, all of their healthcare providers, because this is a chance to spread this as far as possible across Europe, they should promote the use of the HPO, the Human Phenotype Ontology, as the most appropriate ontology to capture phenotypic descriptions. And again, you can see on here how HPO in particular has been selected, because HPO is a bit like the author code, but for phenotyping. It's been agreed as the best, most sensitive system to capture the specific symptoms of different rare diseases. And a lot of work has been going on for the past few years between the OrphaNet team and the team who created the Human Phenotype Ontology, the HPO, to make sure that actually when you go to OrphaNet and you search for a condition, the description of the symptoms, the phenotype that you will find there, all of those terms have been mapped to the HPO. So it's the best possible quality of data, it's the most accurate, but it's also the most interoperable if you want to exchange data between registries, between electronic health records, and whatever else. So you can read all of these in your own time, but the idea was to give people some practical guidance. And again, you see the bottom one here, one of the things that we suggest the ERNs might want to do, and some of them have started doing this already, which is great, is they might want to come together and try to organise special meetings or workshops to actually, again, look at the HPO, look at the ontology, and see how good it is for their disease. So I know that the neuromuscular field did this a couple of years ago. Because like anything, the HPO is not perfect. And if you want to make it better, if you want to make it really specific for your field, you have to get together. And as clinicians and patients, you tell the creators of this ontology, look, you're saying these terms are the same, actually they're not. Or maybe this is something that we want to measure, but there's no term in your HPO for this, so you need to create one. So that, again, is the sort of practical guidance we try to promote. I'm going to cover the last two of our focal tools in less detail, partly because we haven't got loads of time, but also because they're quite complicated. And actually, I think the best way to understand them is to read that recommendation document that we produced. It's not horribly long. Each of these four has about 1.5 pages of content, but it gives you a good idea. So, linking data, we tried to present at this big workshop in April some of the state-of-the-art ways by which data can become linkable. Linkable meaning it can be shared within a single system like the CPMS, but those of you who are following projects like RD Connect on the research field will know that if we ever want to really propel the pace of research in rare diseases, it's really important to know when different sources of data on the same patient, collected and stored in different places, actually refer to the same patient. But you want to do that in a way that doesn't reveal any privacy issues or doesn't break any laws or ethical considerations. So under actually our EURORDIS colleagues in RD Connect project, they did a lot of work on different systems and way that actually you can anonymize or pseudonymize a patient's name, a patient's identifiable data, so that nonetheless a researcher who wants to know, okay, Matt has his information in a registry for a particular disease, but Matt was also in a clinical trial and we have some data from him in that trial database. Matt also contributed a blood sample, so we have that in a biobank in Germany. Also, Matt has now been enrolled in an ERN for some sort of virtual care. So how on earth can we tell, given that none of this will have identifying data about Matt, how can we tell that these all relate to Matt? So we started talking here about a concept called a PPRL, which is a privacy-preserving record linkage. It's not an identifier, that's the opposite. An identifier means that you can somehow identify a patient. A PPRL, and you can see this at the bottom here, no, maybe you can't. Yeah, so a PPRL, a privacy-preserving record linkage, is a solution which is being worked on by the global rare disease field. So not just by RD Connect, but also by the EURORDIS, which is the International Rare Disease Research Consortium. So all of these people across the different continents are coming together to say, look, how can we do something with the data in all these different sources? And the solution that they are looking at is that actually what we need to use is a system that generates a pseudonymizer, so a long list of nonsense letters and numbers, which in no way could tell us that is Matt. But that actually, even if Matt gets different pseudonyms from every source of data his data is in, so he'll have one pseudonym, say A345, it'd be a lot more complex than that. But let's say his registry codes him as A345. And let's say his trial database or his ERN record dates him as A792, and his biosample in Germany in the biobank, his blood sample, codes him as X347. We need a way that actually a researcher would be able to know that each of those is Matt. They all come from the same patient. They don't need to know it's Matt, but they need to know that they're all from the same patient. And that's important because if Matt's case is really interesting and they want to get hold of a biosample to do some further tests on this and to look at, do some basic research, how do they get hold of their biosample? We have one. We have one in the German biobank because we can search that and we can find that it's Matt without ever letting Matt's private information leave where it was initially collected. I'm possibly not explaining this terribly well, but the concept is that as the clinical, where's my little thing? So as your clinical data is collected here inside the hospital, so you enter this into a system, and that will give you, and you will, the key point about this PPRL is that you have to all, no matter where you are in the world, enter the same few elements of identifiable data in the first place. There's no way this can work if you collect, for example, names and dates of birth in a different way. So you have to all agree that you'll collect these 4 or 5 elements of information for every patient. And then what it does is the IT system will encrypt that and give you sort of a string of nonsense. It sends it to a database somewhere else, so way away from the hospital, and that gives you your pseudonym, so your AB459, and that goes back and that's recorded here. But that same pseudonym goes to a trusted third party, which is outside of both of these. This is all a bit legal and technical. But the idea is that nobody could ever actually connect that these few things are Matt Johnson. Only the trusted third party system here could ever hold that information. But your researcher could query these services and they could say, actually, yes, we have this information in these different resources all comes from Matt. If you have questions about this, and I hope they're not too complicated, I may have to refer some to our legal experts who are working on this. The idea is that it's a way of making the most of our data. And we said, as a bottom line, as a conclusion, wouldn't it be great if the ERNs actually play ball with this? If they try to do what the broader rare disease research field is doing, especially given that ERNs are supposed to be about research as well, let's use these same methods to pseudonymize patients in an ERN. And our final tool that we promoted was actually, it's kind of a combination of the 3 that I've just presented. It's a concept of FAIR data. And FAIR is an acronym. It stands for making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. It's a concept which did not originate in rare diseases. It didn't even originate in health data. It came from the sort of, big data computing field. And it's all about good data stewardship. Because in this day and age, especially in fields like rare diseases, we have so much potential to collect information and to share it. But we know that there are legal and ethical issues against doing that. So technically you can share stuff easily. You can put everything in the cloud, but obviously we don't want to be doing that in an unguarded way with health data. So the FAIR data team, who are based in the Netherlands, it's the team of a guy called Baron Mons, who's very, very big in data and computing. He pioneered this set of principles. And what it means is that actually you always capture your data, whether it's data in a health system, in a health record, or data in a registry, or here, what we try to push in our workshop, data in an ERN, you always capture it and treat it and put it in there in a certain way so that it will be able to comply with FAIR principles. What does that mean? These are some examples of some of the slides which we looked at in the workshop. And the bottom line is that information on the top here, I'll get my pointer again, this is very much all written in English language and you couldn't share this. So say this information on one patient is in a registry. Say this information on Annika is in a separate registry in a different country. Say this information on Rajaram is held, for example, in an ERN. Say this information on Pietro is held in a clinical record in a different health system, say Hungary. If you want to be able to connect that data and make some use of it because they all have, for example, the same condition and data on rare diseases is precious, you can't just send all of that in that format. You can't, it's very difficult to share data across borders these days when you have all of this personally identifiable information attached to it. But what you can do is you can make it searchable. And that's what all of this sort of jargon, computery nonsense down here is. This is basically coded data which has been made fair. It says exactly the same as what it says up here, but it says it in a computer readable and computer understandable format. And what it means is that a researcher could actually query each of these different resources and they could get back the information they need. So they could know that actually they have 4 patients with such and such a condition, and they could know a bit about the phenotype. And again, this is really, really important if you want to be able to do research, to learn more about the natural history of a disease, to recruit patients for trials. It's a way of unlocking the many, many different sources of precious rare disease data that we have. And again, this is thinking beyond just the ERN specifically. This will make more sense if you have a look at our document, which explains step by step what we want people to do with fair data and why we want them to do it. So what are we doing at the moment? Some really nice practical things emerged from that workshop. The most important of these is our recommended good practices document, and I've given you some highlights from this. And as I said, this has been shared with all the ERNs. What we want them to do now is to use it, because there are things in here which they can do independently as coordinators or HCPs. They can do things, for example, about improving the OrphaNet coding system for their disease area. And in fact, a really nice practical outcome of that workshop was up here. You see OrphaNet actually sent letters, formal letters of understanding to all the ERNs and invited them formally to participate in actually contributing to improving the coding system for their disease. And that's really, really important for the rare disease field. We gave them all these practical toolkits on how they can use these different 4 resources, what they can do next. But the bottom line is that, we have this document now which spells out some quite easy wins that all of us can be doing with our data to make it interoperable, to make it go further. What we need is to actually ask our ERN leads to promote this document and to share it with all of their centres, not just the coordinators, because it's a great chance to get some of these tools used more broadly across the rare disease sphere and actually hopefully to start seeping into the national systems as well. And we also want all of our ERNs to be lobbying as much as they can with the official CPMS team from the Commission, because the version of that IT platform, that CPMS that you will all be using in the coming weeks and months to start sharing your cases, that's not the final version. The contract means that over the next couple of years, the open app providers will be working with each ERM to tailor that to include your specific needs and requirements. So wouldn't it be great if all of the ERNs were lobbying and saying, look, we had this workshop, we were all there, these are some of the important quick wins and less quick wins, some of it's more longer term, that we want to see to make the data in an ERN go that little bit further and fulfill many, many purposes. So we need your support as ePAGs to help us to do this. So I'm going to stop there.
So Vicky, I think you've gone through and highlighted 4 systems or approaches which are out there, which can help us connect data and make data usable for healthcare or research purposes. ERNs are about stepping out of silos. So for clinicians, that's just them talking to each other, but for data, connecting the data up is really important, and I think they're great examples. I think we're missing at the moment, and maybe you might be able to say more, are we missing a strategic endpoint of what we want the data to be, which is signed off by the Commission and Member States? Because at the moment we've got the CPMS, which is being developed in the immediate to help do consultation, but really don't we want the total caseload, don't we want phenotype and genomic data for all the patients within a HCP? And are we missing that endpoint to say what we, and is this Commission developing a strategy on that, an information strategy?
In an ideal world, what we'll have in, I don't know if it'll be a few years, if it'll be 20 years, 30 years, if ever, what we want really is for all data, whether it's collected in the CPMS, so in other words, for patients who are shared in the ERN for care, all that data to be fully interoperable with all the data collected by each of the 900 healthcare providers for the patients that they see routinely when they come to their expert centre for rare diseases. And we want that data to be interoperable with all the data in the broader healthcare systems in each country. And we want it also to be interoperable with all the information and data held in rare disease registries, whether it's national registries, global registries. And we want all of that data to be interoperable with all the biobanks on rare diseases that we have, with all the biosamples. It's a massive, massive goal, and we have to be very sort of, we have to focus on a little piece of the puzzle at a time. What's really important and useful, I think, for me, is that across all of those different areas of data, different types of data sources that I just mentioned, groups and projects are working to promote awareness of the benefits of these tools that we've been talking about here. The human phenotype ontology and the author code, the AuthorNet code, are very, very well accepted in the rare disease field, and actually they are the standards which are being promoted under a big new 5-year research program for rare diseases called the EJP, or the European Joint Program. And they're being promoted as the go-to standards to use for a reason, because they've reached that certain level of maturity. What you don't want to do is to tie your wagon to a star that's actually going to burn out and come crashing down. In other words, the tools and the coding systems, etc., that we recommend have to be good. They have to have longevity. So although we won't get everywhere we want to be from the beginning, at least actually by, using, as I said at the start, the opportunity of these networks beginning from scratch and this CPMS starting from scratch, it's a really good way to at least get people using the tools and standards that everybody else is using in all these different data communities, whether it's registries or biobanks. Electronic health records and health systems is a massive goal, and it's a little bit apart, or has been apart traditionally. The ERNs are a way forward here, and you're absolutely right. We have to think about how the networks are going to not just collect and share data on the small number of cases that they refer amongst themselves, because that's probably going to be anything from, 1 patient per week to maybe 10 patients, nothing like the thousands that they'll be seeing in each of the healthcare providers, every year. So how we actually make the most of their information and link their data to this central system, it's a key question.
So there's some questions which have been posted in the chat box. Andre said, in which way can you connect all the different IDs into one single one?
So this is about this pseudonymization idea, and this PPRL, which is this privacy preserving record linkage. When we gave this webinar a year ago, we talked about something called the GUID, which was the Global Unique Identifier, because the top minds in rare disease research globally from all the different countries and continents thought, okay, what we can do is have a single identifier for any patient. What that means is when you capture information on me, whoever it is, whichever physician in whichever country who captures my data for something, they will enter these 4 or 5 pieces of information about me, so my name, my date of birth, my city of birth, something else, and that will always give you the same string of nonsense no matter who enters it. Now, that was the idea behind this GUID, or Global Identifier, and there, indeed, everybody would always have the same ID. Now, we've moved on a year, and the legal people have said, even that is actually, it's not strong enough protection to go across borders, to go between the US and Europe, which is difficult anyway, but to go across European countries. So in this PPRL system, the way it works is that actually each time one of these clinicians or researchers enters my 4 or 5 pieces of information, they will get back a different string of nonsense. It will not always say A345. But by using this secure third party, which is essentially a clever server based outside of the hospitals and outside of the company which gives you this A345, this secure server will be able to tell that A345 comes from the same person as B345. So I will have different identifiers, but they will be linked through this secure third party. You need a secure third party to do it. What I can send you if you're interested is a paper from the rare cancer field, because they're one of the few communities that's actually already using this sort of a system. And they're using it very well. They're ahead of us in lots of ways, actually, the pediatric cancer people, because they've had more investment and more mature systems. So I can give you a more detailed breakdown of how this works. We can circulate that if that's helpful, actually.
So we've also had a question from so Jean-Philippe. Hopefully everyone can hear me, because there was a couple of comments that you can't. So Jean-Philippe said, how are you going to disseminate the recommendations and make them real? So you've mentioned in the next steps how the Orphanet and HPO are engaging with the ERNs to get their buy-in and support, get them to be champions of those systems. Is there anything which is specifically needed relating to the CPMS? Because that seems to be where the buck stops.
Yeah, I'm actually reading on that. Russell's comment below there and ERNI is one of the stars in this, because they really have taken these sort of practices and recommendations, and they've really run with that. So as Russell said, the IERNs actually already organise workshops to perfect the different ontologies and the terminology around coding the diseases under the eye category, but also their clinical symptoms. So that's wonderful, and that's, I think it's a brilliant model for a lot of the other networks. Of course, these things take resources, and resources are so limited. I think what would be good for the CPMS team is just to make, we've tried to make the coordinators aware that they will be invited and are being invited by the Open App team to tailor the CPMS. I think officially all requests for tailoring that CPMS has to go through the Commission IT team, and I suspect they'll be hearing these messages more and more in the coming months. I think the Commission's focusing on actually getting the first version of the platform out and getting patients being reviewed. But really, we want, at the minimum, a good way to use the HPO and a proper way to capture the author code in that platform. That should be there as the absolute bare minimum, really. So I think, when you have meetings, when you have sort of steering committee meetings or meetings with the coordinators or kickoff meetings, do promote this document to them. They'll all have seen it. Many of them contributed a bit to it, but they possibly don't quite know that, in fact, if we want some of these specific practices or tools to be embedded in that CPMS for them, they have to make their voices heard, and they have to lobby for that. So we're saying from the joint action side to the Commission team, use this. It was a consensus document. We don't come together for these workshops for nothing. We don't write these things for fun. They're there to have an impact. But the more you can add your voice to that, tweeting it, all these sorts of things will be really, really helpful.
So there is one more question related to, do patients have to give consent, specific consent? That was by, I'm going to say the name wrong. Is it Ilara?
Ilaria. Yeah, so certainly for the CPMS, which is of course the ERN's platform for sharing data, when a patient is referred to the ERN for shared care, whether it's for a second opinion or for advice on whether they should do an operation, a specific procedure, whatever it might be, the patient will be asked to read an information sheet about ERNs and what the principle is, and then they'll be asked to consent, first of all, to their information being shared for care. If they say no, then the patient will not be seen, will not be referred to the ERN. They will stay, nothing more will happen, and their local doctor or team will continue to treat them as best they can. So you have to consent for your information to be shared in that system. Then you also have an option on that same form to consent if you wish for your data to be pseudonymized and retained in that system for reuse. And that was the kind of thing I was mentioning earlier from our brainstorm. So the different forms that reuse might take is that the ERN coordinators, they might wish to use that case as an example of, such and such a patient had such and such a clinical presentation, they had this specific diagnosis. What we advised was that, in fact, if they go to see a cardiac specialist, that will actually preempt some serious cardiological problems in the future. Or such and such a patient with such and such a situation, we decided would actually benefit very much from a specific type of brain surgery or, urological procedure or whatever it is. So you will be asked to consent for anything to happen with your data. And there's no consequences, as always.
So I'm going to do one more question before we move on to the next section. And that's, I think it's from Anne, how databases will be updated with the evolution of new diagnostics at an EU level?
Well, I mean, I think it depends a bit about which databases we mean. And actually, one key question for me is how much the different ERNs will really use this CPMS platform to do high-level diagnostics. So yes, indeed, I'm a patient. A clinician is trying to figure out what's happening with me. They don't really know what my condition is. So they will absolutely call upon the services of the ERN and refer me, if I consent, to get some diagnostic advice. However, what will not happen is my that platform, that CPMS, is not designed to support the massive volumes of data that you get in something like next generation sequencing. So what often you need to do for rare diseases is you need to do whole exome or whole genome sequencing to find that diagnosis quicker. And that also depends upon you collecting good clinical data to align the two. So how those big, next generation sequencing platforms, how they will engage with the ERN system, I don't know. I think what a lot of them will do is the experts on the ERN will say, okay, we really recommend that you do a whole exome sequence and that you look particularly for this, this, and this. And they will probably point them towards an existing platform which has been set up to do this next-gen sequencing diagnostics. So something like RD Connect, which is the only one that's specific for rare diseases. And actually the sequencing would take place outside of the ERN, and it would be the diagnosis that would kind of come back to those clinicians. But the good thing is that all of these platforms like the RD Connect diagnostics pipelines and the next generation sequencing database, that's really where these good practices and these ontologies started from. So they all use human phenotype ontology. They will all be using the same system of pseudonymizing their patients for research. So that's why, as I said, if we all get these standards and good practices in there early, as much as we can, we're going to be tied in and not locked out from what these big research
initiatives are doing. So I think just to clarify, the CPMS system isn't a registry. The CPMS system is just a way to connect the centres in a network to share a clinical case for diagnosis, discussion, or advice. It's a standard system, quite generic in some ways, but I believe it's quite useful. You can share scans like MRI scans and CT scans, etc. However, for rare diseases, different rare diseases, you need different diagnostic or imagery software. So for bone, you have to be able to do animated bone scans where it's moving. For epilepsy, you have to have telemetry information, which is little lines which show brain activity. So currently, the CPMS system is standard for what it does, but for all the networks have said there needs to be adapted specific to their needs. So for rare eye, they need to be able to see scans of the eye. So Russell's Online, the network, Rare Eye Network, is heavily advocating and lobbying the CPMS and the Commission for the adapting the system to meet their specific needs. So I think this is a massive subject, and I don't think we're going to get to all your questions now. I think we've got another part of the webinar to do, and we've used an hour already. So I'm just Yeah, go on.
And there's some great questions in there. So what we'll do is we'll get this. There should be a way, I'm sure, for the chat list for the organisers to sort of record the chat box, and then we can come back to all of these questions, you know, in writing as well. I think that's what we did last time. So the ones that
And
we've
what
missed,
I
we will come
might
back to.
propose, and I'm going to get Vicky on camera. We talked with the way the networks are being set up. You have in the border member states different working groups overlooking specific things, like a relationship with industry, cross-border care, and the Commission have also developed working groups for the network coordinators, one for ethics, one for IT, and one for monitoring and outcomes, etc. So EURORDIS want to support the ePAG members to come together who are interested in IT or interested in clinical outcomes or interested in guidelines. So following this webinar, I think we'll set up an ePAG group where people can join a call and take part, and we'll invite Vicky to come and take part in that, to carry on the discussion, to share knowledge and understanding like Russell's doing today about what's happening in the rare eye, so we can learn from each other. So we'll set up a call once every 3 months maybe, where people who are interested in the IT side of ERNs can come together and share knowledge, and we'll invite Vicky to that. So Vicky, moving on to the next section.
Yeah, so I also wanted to talk to you about the other big workshop that we've delivered since we had this last big webinar together about this time last year. So this one followed very hot on the heels of our second Brussels one, which was the data one I've just been talking about. This is about 4 weeks later. We held this one in Newcastle, and you can see Mary down here. From our ePAG representatives. This workshop was on a very, very different topic. I think it's probably a more comprehensible topic, even if you haven't got a lot of background knowledge on it. So I'm gonna, it won't take as long to give you the highlights as the previous one, where there was a lot of sort of explanatory stuff. So this was on the topic of indicators and outcome measures to demonstrate the impact and added value of ERNs. Okay, so why? Well, why did we do this topic? It actually encompasses two quite different things. So on the one hand, we've got indicators, which are all about demonstrating what you're doing and what sort of effect and impact and added value it has. And then you've got outcome measures, and very much more on the clinical side, which show that actually the advice or the care or the expertise is making a difference to patients. So they're two quite different things, but we actually needed, because of the other activities going on in DG Sante and the other stakeholder needs, it was important that we actually try to address both of these things in one workshop. So I'm going to talk a bit more about the performance indicator side of things and how we sort of monitor the ERNs and what they're doing. And then Matt's going to talk a bit about the outcome measures and how you on Earth you start to look at what works clinically for patients. So on the performance indicator side, the problem, as you all know, problem but opportunity, is that ERNs have a really broad mandate. They have to do so many different things. They have to show impact across, care and research and everything in between. So to do that, you have to really think about what sort of indicators you're going to be using to hold the networks to account, to show what they're doing, but also to convince other players, so member state authorities, European Commission, patients, to show people that actually these networks are doing something and they're having an impact. So we need to have a bit of a balance here. You can't be measuring thousands and thousands of different things. So we try to get people thinking about what sort of indicators can be collected for what purpose. Those of you who were part of the application process for the networks will know that actually the coordinators all had to propose some sort of indicators that they would be collecting and presenting every year or so. And that's part of their conditions for their coordination grant that they get. That's the 200,000 per year. So we're really looking at two broad sets of indicators. On the one hand, it's common indicators that you could actually collect regardless of what disease area or procedure your ERN looks like. And then secondly, the more disease-specific things, which will vary tremendously, not just from network to network, but also across different diseases. So we had a couple of big aims. The first one was to actually understand what on earth we're talking about with indicators. People use these different terms. There are different types of indicators, structure, process, outcome, and how they're used. So we brought some methodological experts in from outside of the field to try and give us a bit of a background on this. And I would highly recommend that you have a look at some of their PowerPoints, which you can find on the website, because that really takes you through and explains the different terminology. Then, when it comes to this quest to try and think about some common indicators that could be collected by all the networks, we got people working in groups, and we started looking at an initial draft of a table of indicators which had been proposed ahead of this workshop by our Commission colleagues. So these were proposed indicators that all of the networks could be collecting, probably annually, which will show us what they've been achieving and what added value they have. And I'll talk about this. I'll show you some of the examples of these in a second to make it a bit more alive for you. And then the third category, the third aim, was around trying to agree together what are the real challenges when you're trying to select clinically oriented indicators. How on earth do you tell what works? What's a meaningful impact for a patient? So these were the key questions. All of the workshops that we organise, we try to drill down before we start to what are our key questions. And I won't go through all of these, but just to highlight a few of them, we wanted to talk about how ERNs will show that they're having an impact, how will they show that they're performing, what can you realistically measure, what could be common to all, how can patient-reported outcomes be incorporated? And actually, this is a tricky one, but it's one that all of the ERNs agree is going to be really crucial to get more information, more data, certainly on the clinical outcomes from patients directly. So we really need to think about how we can do this. And actually, this workshop barely scratched the surface on that. We were focused on so many things. I think it's a topic that needs a standalone event somehow, really on its own. So to give you a bit of background, this is one of the Commission slides. Why are we talking about this? Why are the ERNs going to be assessed or monitored? Well, we know that officially, as per the legal acts, the ERNs in theory are forever, but they will all be evaluated formally after 5 years. The problem is the Commission and the Member States didn't want to wait 5 years before they actually do some monitoring and do some assessment. They want to see how things are going on a more regular basis, and that's partly tied up to these coordination grants. As you know, whenever you get funding for anything, you have to show what you're doing and how you're performing and how you're using the funding. So the Commission were very keen for us to work with them in the joint action on this workshop to try to find a way to address one particular dimension of this assessment and monitoring, which I've lost my arrow, where is he? Okay, which is around the continuous monitoring. So this is what we're looking at. There's various other types of assessment, for example, assessing the healthcare providers, assessing new centres in future, but we didn't really touch upon that. We were really looking at a way that actually every year we can look at what the healthcare providers are doing and what the ERN is achieving. And again, this comes down to common indicators, key performance indicators, and these key performance indicators, they cover different areas. They do start to look at clinical activity. They also look at lots of sort of governance-y, operational network activities like having meetings, and then they also have to relate to knowledge generation, training, and research. I'm actually going to skip a couple of these. I wanted to pull out a couple of the slides from our methodology experts around what indicators are and how you can put them together. But I think this one is quite a nice example of the complexity involved in actually agreeing indicators and then how you use them. So an indicator can be something, better health for all. This can be a large goal. But under that heading of better health for all, how do you measure that that's being achieved by a health system? You need to look at lots of different things. You need to look at healthy life years. You need to look at health determinants, staff ratios, evidence-based treatment, disease-specific mortality. And our expert nicely gave us a bit of a summary of what performance indicators are. These let you describe a situation. It shows an impact. So it lets you say that a situation is getting better. So imagine a situation in a hospital, so hospital care. Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Is there no difference? So these performance indicators have to be SMART. And we know that that's our specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. So, for example, what you could use to measure performance might be number of peer-reviewed academic publications, time from referral to specialist, and both of these are important in the ERNs. So, we had a first day which was lots of presentations from our methodological experts on how actually what sort of indicators you use and how health systems can use these, and specifically how specialised areas of healthcare like rare diseases, what you can possibly collect. So I highlighted a few of the key messages from that. An important thing is actually that you really need to think about what you're collecting and why. And every time you collect information, that's work for somebody, so you really need to think about this. Sometimes people think that actually if there's no change in the indicators, no change in the numbers over time, that means that there's a lack of progress or things aren't going well. So that was a real concern for the ERNs, that actually when we're collecting this data, it's not always about the numbers, it's not always bigger is better, and there are things that take a long time to show impact for. He also advised us, this was David, who was working on the Commission methodology team looking at indicators and outcomes, he said it's really, really important that you don't just focus again on your numbers. So things like number of nurses in a hospital, there are things that matter much more, which is the quality of care that they provide and the outcomes of that care for the patients. I'll skip through some of these, but you can have a look just to give you an idea of what structure indicators are, process indicators and outcomes, because the table I'm going to show you in a second actually covers all of these different types of indicators. The ERNs have to be concerned with all of these types of indicators. So for the ERNs, we're really interested in outcomes. We're not interested so much in the structure and the inputs. We're not so interested in the process. It's much more about over here on the right, the outcomes. Okay, so I mentioned that we had a background document. We weren't just starting from scratch in this workshop, which was good. The Commission gave us a nice table where they separated all the different responsibilities and duties of ERNs into seven intervention areas. And these range from organisational things around meetings, to much more meaty things around actually delivering patient care and doing these referrals. You've got your education, your training, your clinical guidelines, etc. And this is what the table looked like. So on the side, you can see here one of their 7 objectives. So this was the first one, which is very procedural, about making sure that the ERNs are operational. So they proposed indicators such as number of member states represented in the network, and it's a structure indicator. And they put in a few comments here, which was largely, to discuss further. Number of member states participating in ERN meetings, number of meetings, blah, blah, blah. So what we did was we got everyone together and we split everyone into groups, multi-stakeholder groups, and we worked through this table. So each of the groups looked at a couple of areas. People's impressions on this paper, what we were trying to do was say, look, in the current Commission draft, is the wording right? Is this achievable? Is it meaningful? People were quite positive because at the end of the day, the Commission created this table based upon the information in the ERN application. So it didn't come from nowhere. I'm going to skim through a few of these. A big issue was actually, are we collecting something just because it's nice to know? Or actually, are we collecting it because it's meaningful for impact and performance? There was also a lot of debate as to whether we should be collecting indicators on things that the ERNs might not be able to control. So, for example, number of member states in the ERN. You can only have a member state centre if that member state is engaged and is playing ball and wants to be part of the networks. So how far can the ERN actually influence that? Then again, it's a really important thing that we want to capture. We want to promote more member states participating in all the networks. So we had lots and lots of discussions here, and actually we saw once again that there's a real variety in terms of what ERN wants to capture, what different ERNs want to capture. I'm going to fast forward this. You can read it yourself. This is really just a list of the overarching comments that people had. But the basic conclusion we had is that actually there's no way we could finalise and agree this table of indicators, these common indicators, there and then in Newcastle in June. We needed to go away and do some more work. So what we did in the joint action over the summer is we captured everyone's comments and discussions on all of these different points. And what was often needed was a much more precise definition of an activity. And that was essential for letting us move forward with this paper. So we tried to give people options. So this is what I mean. This is the old table, and this is the clinical section. So you can see things like time between referral to the ERN and diagnosis. number of patients seen or advised by the ERN. You can see the problem immediately. What constitutes a patient seen or advised by the ERN? How do we distinguish that from a patient seen by the healthcare providers? Number of complications or adverse events. Again, if the ERNs are not actually providing care themselves, it's the centres that are providing care, how do you is it actually meaningful to collect this sort of information? So our table was about 10 times longer than this, because what we did was we turned it into essentially a sort of a workshop report. This is the main body of the workshop report, which will be published if not this week, then next week, so you can find all of this and read it yourself in your own time. For each of these little points, we tried to really drill down to what it meant, and we offered different ways that you could change this wording to make more sense. Again, we don't have too much time to go through this in detail, I think, but you'll have the slides. It'd be interesting to see what you think. The next steps for this paper is that the finalisation of that paper, which is the common indicators for all the ERNs to collect each year, that has been handed over to one of these new working groups, which is chaired by some of the coordinators. In this case, it's chaired by Chris Chappell and Michelle Batty. So they've been really inclusive, and they've been, really accommodating, and they've continued to work with Matt and myself on how we actually get to the final version of this paper. So that's a good example of how our work has started a really nice, specific, concrete task that the coordinators are now taking ownership of themselves. I think we nearly have a sort of more final version. Matt and I will be talking with Michelle later this week. So as soon as we have the next concrete version of that document, of course, we can share that with everybody, and you can see what we ended up with. But you'll also be able to read that full table of discussions and just teasing out some of the definitions and the problems, as I say, probably next week when we publish the full report. So that was the little section on the common indicators, which took up most of our first day, to be honest, was actually having these discussions. And although it was quite complex, it was really valuable because it helped us all to tease out what we mean and how we understand the absolute core activities of an ERN. It's really important that all networks are counting things the same, because if one network is counting patients seen by the ERN as just the patients referred for shared care in the CPMS, but this network over here is counting all the patients that are seen by every one of their healthcare providers, you're going to have very, very different figures, and they're not going to be meaningful. So it was a useful exercise. Our second day was really interesting for me because this is where we started to look much more at how you actually agree what works at a clinical level, which is a very different thing. And there were discussions and differing opinions here as to actually how far we can agree anything. How far can we issue guidance for the ERNs on how they do this? Some of them felt that actually they had enough data to start agreeing their clinical outcomes for some of their better known diseases pretty much straight away. But for others, they felt really they needed many, many years to start to see what works and what's meaningful at the clinical level. Yeah, so you can see up here, some of the networks were saying, actually, if you're going to say that your ERN is having an impact on treating cancer, it's not something that you can report this time next year. You need at least 5 to 10 years to actually start to show the impact. But for others, and I think Matt was a strong proponent of this, it's probably not good enough to say, well, we won't even think about this now. You have to start thinking about what you can measure, what you can capture. And part of that means actually understanding what sort of case studies people have been using already and how other fields have been able to tackle this despite the traditional low evidence base in rare diseases. So I'm going to hand over to Matt actually to just do the last few slides, which is specific to the clinical outcomes topic, and then maybe we can do questions all together at the end. If you do have to leave, as I know some of you do, then just, if you post your question, then we can follow that up with you afterwards as well. So Matt, I'll hand over to you.
Here, when setting up ERNs, there's lots of things we have to do on the IT level and what data to collect. And we're hearing from Vicky about indicators for the network to demonstrate how they are delivering added value. At the heart of what these networks can do, the real potential is getting clinicians who work across Europe to talk to each other, to share their knowledge and experience on rare cases, on rare presentations. And how do you enable that conversation to take place? Well, to do that really, and to remove the ego from the room, working with a group of paediatric neurosurgeons, they're all saying that I'm very good, I'm the best. How do you enable them to speak to each other to see when one practice is better than the other? And the heart of this is clinical outcomes. If we don't establish simple clinical outcomes now, per rare disease, per your disease, we are losing the opportunity for those clinicians to learn from each other. 5 years, 10 years down the line, measuring the long-term outcomes, survival, yes, that's far off. But by having simple outcomes now, we enable a discussion to say when one practice is better than the other, and for them to then be stealing each other's approaches, which will take forward care massively. I led some networks at a national level, and by having simple outcomes in place, 3 or 4 measures, we enabled those clinicians from centres, 5 centres or more, to come together, and in 2 years we saw improvements to health of people with rare diseases, for that rare disease, by 20 to 30%, just because they could have a common currency to discuss how their different approaches. The ERNs have said in their applications, all of them said that clinical outcomes are seen as a priority area because it enables that benchmarking of care. And there's 2 types of clinical outcomes. There's this structural and process outcomes, but then there's clinical and functional outcomes. Vicky mentioned earlier about the monitoring indicators. So all networks saw that it was important to do in the application process. But in establishing the ERN, we need to try and put at the heart of it a culture of curiosity, of wanting to learn. So, if you ask the networks what are they doing, and how they're prioritizing the work, we need to see that they pull on any form of feedback to identify where they need to improve. Because if they're always looking to where to improve, they'll automatically move forward. And then feedback could be like a serious untoward incident, a never event, something which was terrible, and learning from that and putting in systems to prevent that in other centres, or learning from patient experience surveys or clinical audit and outcomes. The generating knowledge and learning from each other actually is also from the CPMS system. So when they review cases, for very rare conditions, they might not have seen that presentation, and colleagues in another country will. So by talking about that case and reviewing it together as a virtual MDT, that's also a learning environment for those experts. Another thing which we need to put in place is not just identifying simple clinical outcomes, but we need to make sure that the networks once a year have a forum where they come together by rare disease area to share that knowledge and learn from each other through peer learning. So that's where they could share their outcomes, so simple outcomes which are profiled against a case mix and presented in a standardized way, enables for clinicians to know when one surgical approach is better than another, or surgical philosophies developing, or we should be celebrating in all the centres, the 900 centres in the ERNs, we should be celebrating clinical variation and not standardising for the sake of it, only standardising where there's clear evidence that there's an improvement. So by having people meet on an annual basis and learn from each other, we can move forward care quite quickly. For me, it's the most important thing of anything which we do, everything else is an extra. If we can do this, we will be unlocking the potential of all that experience dotted around Europe, because we're getting them to share. And to get them to share, they have to trust each other and respect each other. You don't do that. You develop that trust by meeting and discussing it as a group by rare disease. So I've just presented that, really, so I'm not going to do it again. So I've done 2 case studies of how this has happened in work which I did in the UK. So for lysosomal storage disorders, there was a network in the UK which they came together on an annual basis and shared their knowledge and experience from that past year. And what they found was that for very severe cases, they could do a ERT treatment, an enzyme replacement therapy, to treat the LSD conditions. But what they found was they needed to do early diagnosis, because that first treatment of the enzyme replacement, if it was after the first birthday, you got very poor results in terms of quality of life. Babies would need to be on 24-hour invasive ventilation. So what they learned from discussing the cases and having a clear outcome was to be able to know that early diagnosis was the rate limiting factor for successful use of the enzyme replacement therapy. So the outcome for them was not just survival because of treatment, but good quality of life. And when they came together, they then could also share learning about developing the treatment protocol for that, and whether it was could be used for other types of disease areas. So that's where you developing clinicians coming together with a simple outcome in one respect, to be able to see how to improve their care and generate discussion. Another one, and I'm sure everyone gets bored of me championing neurofibromatosis. I think neurofibromatosis type 1 and type 2 became very close to my heart, because there were a patient community I worked with a lot in the UK. And there was in NF2, which are non-malignant tumours of the central nervous system, up the spinal cord and in the head. Centres before this national network was put in place, there was 4 of them. They used to compete against each other. By coming together as one network, they started to work together, and the competition became more healthy. And what they did was they agreed these simple outcomes here, which you can see in the circles, as a way to compare practice between the centres. I'm not going to read those outcomes, but if you're doing surgery on to remove a vestibular schwannoma from the head, because of all the nerves, you've got a high risk of causing facial palsy, because you've caught the nerve. And so surgeons were waiting a long time to do the operation because it was risky of causing premature deafness or facial paralysis. So their surgical approach was watch and wait, and the tumours became very big. So one of the outcomes was to measure the length of usable hearing, because the tumour would put pressure on the cochlear nerve. So these measures outcome measures were about measuring the time of first presentation to the first surgery, which was quite a long period. The length of time for work, useful hearing and speech discrimination, that people's facial muscles weren't damaged. So those are the types of, and mortality rates as well. By having them in place, what we found was the surgeon started to understand that instead of waiting for the tumours to become very big, and because of the risk of causing premature deafness, they started to go in early and do total debulking of the tumours. So that surgical philosophy developed just because they were able to talk about it and see when one approach was better than another. We used a cancer drug on non-malignant tumours, and we found that it was very effective for the faster growing tumours. And we had a messiah moment. We had someone, a little boy who was 13, who got out of a chair and walked because the tumours reduced and took pressure off his spine. So these are the types of new developments, best practice, just because the clinicians started to talk to each other and had a way of comparing when one approach is better than the other. That's the power of these networks, and that's what our opportunity is, and that's why I'm working on this. So next steps, Vicky. Because time's nearly up. You're on.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah, I muted myself. I was just typing a comment actually to Dahlia and Mary saying absolutely, and I think it's good that we end actually with your bit, Matt, because it brings it back to what matters most for patients. Actually, in some diseases, figuring out what is a benefit on some of these terrible conditions where we know so little about how they advance anyway. It's very, very difficult, but there are, I think, in all of the ERNs, there are the sort of most high profile or most common of the rare conditions they look at where at least the networks can be starting. But it's so important that we keep, at the end of the day, all of this work around indicators and measuring performance and around data and making better use of data, it's all to get better outcomes for patients. So we have to not forget that. And I was just going to agree with Mary that actually I think a great advantage of the ERNs is that we will try to break down some of this professional competition between doctors. Of course, doctors and researchers, they have their careers and they have to be competitive to an extent, but actually the whole ethos of the ERNs is around sharing and collaboration over competition. And I think that actually even the initial applications and the fact that people largely were not competitive and they all did rally around one network, that's a really good sign, I hope, for how we're going to move forward in the future. The next steps is really, I guess, for you guys. So you will of course have the PowerPoint presentation that we've just presented, and as I said, we will come back to any of the comments and questions that we've missed. We'll do that in writing, and then we'll ask the team to circulate that to all of you. The workshop pages are, I think, the best start to get more information. The paper on the common indicators, so I just showed some snapshots of that because it's the sort of thing that, to be honest, you could talk for a couple of hours about on its own, and it is really interesting because it does really break down and get to the heart of what the networks are going to do and how they're going to do it, because it forces you to do that when you're thinking, what can we actually capture and measure? So that, as I said, is still being whittled down a bit further, but you'll be able to view the full table with all of the workshop groups' very valuable comments and discussion feedback around all of those different sections. So that should be ready very, very soon. To be honest, we prioritise producing that paper over producing the sort of more formal report in the end, because that was deemed slightly more urgent for the networks, but we will be making it a bit more understandable and accessible. And then you have the outputs on the data side, on the recommendations. I've pointed at the end that these workshops, they are a beginning, they are not an end. A slight concern that I have is, of course, that the project doesn't last forever, and so I think it's really important that the Commission finds a way, without just simply overloading the ERN coordinators, that they find a way to actually continue to support some of these explorations, because a particularly important one for me is what Matt's just been talking about, the disease-specific outcomes, but also how we actually really harness patient involvement in this, and how patients can provide data and information on their own care and their own outcomes, because that is a massive missed trick at the moment, and I know that the coordinators all agree with this. They're very, very keen to find a way to get patients actually contributing their data on their symptoms and their experiences directly. So any bright ideas about how we can push forward some of this work,
I think we've nearly finished. There was just a comment. So Vicky, thank you so much for coming and presenting. I think I can't even begin to try and talk about Orphanet and HPO and fair data. I learn something every time you speak about it. So you are now officially the data queen in ERNs, because you do pull it all together, which is very difficult for us all to hold in our heads. So it was a fantastic presentation. Thank you. In terms of the next steps, there was a question about the workshop in Rome, and we have, I think, 10 places for ePAG reps to come. We are targeting our approach to invite people just because there's patient reps who've worked on the joint action or the JARC, the rare cancer joint action, who are working in the guideline development section. So we are engaging with a few people to try and identify those now. So if you are interested, please let us know. But I can't promise places directly because it's going to be overbooked. But we will engage with you all. So I just wanted to. There's a few questions. There isn't. The agenda's being drafted at the moment for Rome, Mary. So I'm going to. Anything else? We'll pick up any of the questions via email. So I just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone joining today. It's a very rich and complex area, so thank you for joining in and for your great questions. And thank you, Vicky, for giving up your time. It's I know you're very busy, and it's greatly appreciated. So,
okay. You're very welcome. It's a pleasure. We'll do the next one on the clinical practice guidelines. We'll do it maybe a bit sooner after. It won't be before Christmas because the workshop's quite close to Christmas. But maybe we can look at January and do it while it's fresh in our minds. Because I know it's probably a bit intense for you, giving you two topics together. I'm sorry we've gone a little bit over our time, but we wanted to give you as many kind of highlights as possible so you can follow all of them.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, and thanks, Vicky, again, and Eva and Jean-Marc for all your support as well. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye. Thanks, Matt. Bye.